On a night when the snow hit my windows like fists, my phone rang with a voice so small it barely felt real. Aunt Astra, I'm alone. I'm starving. I'm freezing. Please. My 5-year-old niece whispered those words like she was fading out of the world. She was supposed to be safe at my parents' house. She was supposed to be loved. But when I got there, when I opened that door, I found something that made my blood burn in a way I didn't know a human heart could burn. And that was only the beginning. My name is Astra Vale, and this is the night everything I believed about family shattered in my hands. But before I share my story with you, I'd love to know you're here with me. Just say, listening in the comments, or tell me where you're from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection reminds me I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if my voice reaches you, please consider subscribing. It means more than you think, especially for someone who spent her whole life fighting to be heard. By the time I got off work that night, the cold had sunk all the way into my bones. The garage in Albany always felt like a metal box in winter, but that night it was worse. Every time the bay door rolled up, the wind slapped straight through my coveralls. When I killed the engine and sat for a second in my car outside my apartment, the snow swirling in the headlights made it look like I was driving through static. Inside the place was quiet in that too big way it had been since Ethan moved out 2 months ago. There were still those weird empty patches on the wall where his concert posters used to hang on the bookshelf that now had more dust than books on the bathroom sink where there used to be a second toothbrush. I kicked off my boots, shook my hair free from the wool cap, and heard the weather guy mumbling from the old TV. I never bothered to turn off before work. Blizzard warnings, hazardous travel, only go out if absolutely necessary. I snorted to myself. Story of my life. 2 jobs, a failed marriage, and a family I did my best not to think about. Freedom and loneliness share the same couch. That's something I'd learned the hard way. It was a strange relief not to be fighting with Ethan anymore, not to hear doors slam or sarcastic comments about my issues, but the silence had its own way of pressing in. I shrugged out of my heavy coat and tossed it on the chair, my eyes landing on the only framed photo I hadn't packed away. Me, Orion, and tiny newborn Lumi, her whole face wrinkled as she screamed at the world. I picked it up without meaning to, running my thumb over Orion's stupid, proud grin. I hadn't been back to Syracuse in months. Every time I told myself I would make the trip, something in me tightened, and I'd find another excuse: extra shift at the shop, overtime at the diner on weekends, car trouble, anything. The truth was uglier. The house I grew up in wasn't a place I visited. It was a place I escaped. Letting my parents take Lumi after Orion broke apart had felt like the responsible thing to do, at the time the adult decision. They had a house, a fixed income, a stable address. I had a toolbox, a rented apartment, and a heart that never seemed to stop bracing for impact. Still, every time I looked at that picture, the same thought whispered, you owe her. You owe that little girl more than phone calls and birthday packages you send late. I set the frame down and told myself the same lie I always did, that I'd think about it tomorrow. Not tonight. Tonight, I just wanted a hot shower, something microwaved, and maybe 5 hours of sleep before the next shift. My phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number, Syracuse area code. I stared at it, thumb hovering over decline. Spam calls had gotten creative lately, and I already had enough noise in my head. The phone kept vibrating. Something in my chest tightened, a prickle at the back of my neck I knew too well. I sighed and swiped to answer. Hello. At first, all I heard was wind, a hollow rushing sound, and then a small voice pushed through like it was fighting to exist. Aunt Astra. My hand clenched around the phone. Lumi. Her voice was shredded from crying, thin and shaky, like it might break apart if I breathed too loud. I'm alone, she whispered. I'm starving. I'm freezing. I'm so scared. Please, Aunt, help me. Behind her words, I could hear the moan of the storm and something else, metal rattling like a loose door chain or a vent vibrating. My brain tried to make sense of it while my mouth moved on its own. Where are you? Are you at the house? Where's Grandma? Where's Grandpa? Is the door locked? Lumi, talk to me. There was a little gulp, the sound of her trying to be brave. They said I was bad, so I have to be locked in. I'll be good now, Aunt. I promise. Can you come? My heart dropped physically, like someone had cut it free and let it fall through my ribs. Locked where? In your room, in the basement, Lumi, tell me. The line crackled. Her voice thinned out, swallowed by static. Please, I'm so cold. Then nothing. Lumi, I stared at the screen. Call failed. I hit redial once, twice, 3 times. No answer. I went straight to my parents' landline, then my mother's cell, then my father's. Each call rang and rang until voicemail picked up my mother's bright, fake, cheerful voice telling me to leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Like, this was about a bake sale, not a child. Pick up the damn phone. I hissed into the empty kitchen. No one did. The feeling that rose in me wasn't just fear. It was old and sour and familiar. This again. My parents had a talent for disappearing whenever things got hard. They had done it when I was 14 and needed them to hear me. They had done it when Orion called them drunk at midnight, sobbing after Celine died. Why should tonight be any different? For half a second I tried to rationalize. Maybe Lumi had a nightmare and my parents were asleep upstairs. Maybe she'd played with the phone. Maybe locked in meant a timeout in her room. But the tremor in her voice, the way she said freezing the sound of that metal, the way my own hands were shaking my body, believed her, even while my brain scrambled for excuses. I grabbed the TV remote and turned the volume up. The weather guy was pointing at a band of heavy snow right over the thruway, warning everyone to stay off I-90. Low visibility whiteout conditions, only essential travel, he said. The map of New York glowed a sick, pulsing blue. I stood in the middle of my tiny living room, keys digging into my palm. Driving 2 hours into a blizzard at midnight was a bad idea. That's what any rational person would say. But rational people didn't grow up pounding on a locked shed door until their fists bled while their mother pretended not to hear. Rational people didn't have a niece who had just whispered that she was alone and starving and freezing. I went to the hall closet and yanked my heaviest coat off the hook. Gloves, hat, scarf, flashlight, the small folding knife I'd carried since high school, after one too many nights walking home alone, into the pockets. In the mirror by the door, I caught a flash of a girl I used to be, wide-eyed, jaw clenched, listening for footsteps outside a locked door. Not again, I said to her. Not to her. I locked up the apartment and ran back out into the snow. On the highway, the world shrank down to the space between my headlights. Snow slapped the windshield in chaotic diagonals. The wipers worked like they were fighting for their lives. My fingers ached on the steering wheel. I turned the heat all the way up and still couldn't get warm. Fear, anger, guilt. They all feel the same in your body after a while. Somewhere past the first toll booth, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A notification, not a call. I glanced over long enough to see an old email thread pop to the top of my inbox like something had been bumped. The sender's name hit me like another jolt of cold. Celine. Orion's wife. Dead for years. The subject line, dated 3 weeks before the accident, read, "If something happens, promise me you'll protect Lumi." I stared at it too long, drifting toward the rumble strip, the car shuddering as if to slap me awake. I jerked the wheel, heart slamming against my ribs. Not now. I couldn't read it now. But the words burned in my mind anyway. If something happens. What had she seen? What had she known about my parents that even I, their oldest child, hadn't let myself admit? "Hold on, baby," I said out loud, not sure if I meant Lumi or some version of myself or both. Just hold on a little longer. The drive felt like an hour and also like a week. By the time I turned off the interstate toward my parents' neighborhood in Syracuse, the snow was piled in soft walls on either side of the road. The subdivision looked almost peaceful, every house wearing a thick white roof, windows glowing amber here and there where people were watching movies, tucking kids into bed, living normal lives. My parents' house was dark. No light in the front windows, no soft blue TV flicker against the curtains, no car in the driveway. I pulled up to the curb and killed the engine, my breath fogging in the sudden silence. For a second, I just sat there listening to the ticking of the cooling motor and the muffled roar of the wind. Then I forced myself out into the snow. It came up almost to my shins, dry and powdery, squeaking under my boots. I climbed the front steps and hammered on the door. "Mom, Dad, it's me. Open up, Lumi." No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. I rang the doorbell until my finger hurt. Nothing stirred. I stepped back, scanning the two upstairs windows that had been mine and Orion's once upon a time. Both were dark rectangles now. I went around the side of the house, the wind carving frozen lines into my cheeks, the snow blowing sideways. The back door off the kitchen was locked too. The small patio was pristine, no footprints except the ones I was making now. No one had gone in or out since the snowfall started. I pressed my gloved hand to the siding near where I knew the utility closet and the old storage room were inside. The wood was ice cold under my palm. I held my breath. At first, there was only the sound of the storm, a distant hum of someone's heating unit from down the block. Then, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, I heard it, a tiny choked sound, like a sob pressed into someone's own sleeve. It came from the wall by the back of the kitchen, exactly where the storage room, what my father always called the shed, backed up against the exterior. My chest constricted. Lumi. I whispered to the wind, though I knew she couldn't hear me. My knees felt weak for a second, the past and present folding over each other like two films projected on the same screen. I straightened, scooped a fist-sized rock out of the buried flower bed by the steps, and closed my fingers around it until they hurt. If they were home, they'd had their chance to answer the door. If they weren't, then whatever was happening to Lumi was happening right now, alone in the dark. I took one step back from the glass of the kitchen door, lifted my arm and thought, if no one's going to open this door, I will. Before that rock hit the glass, before the sound of breaking would snap me back into the cold present, a part of me was already somewhere else, back in another winter, another night, another door that never opened. Maybe that's why I'm telling you this, because none of what I did for Lumi makes sense unless you understand what it meant to grow up in the Vale house. My dad Harlan wasn't a monster in the way people picture monsters. He was a construction guy with bad knees, a permanent beer in his hand after 5 p.m., and a story about how hard his life had been ready for anyone who'd listen. I suffered so you can too could have been printed on our family crest. If something went wrong, a bill late, a job slow, a car breaking down, it wasn't life, it was us. We were ungrateful, lazy, too soft. My mom, Marla, loved to talk about sacrifice. She'd tell anyone at church or in line at the grocery store how much she'd given up for her kids, how proud she was. At home, her favorite sentence was, "What happens in this house stays in this house." She could smile so sweetly at neighbors it made your teeth ache, then turn around and slice you open with a single comment about your weight, your grades, your tone of voice. I was the oldest, the built-in assistant, the extra pair of hands. By 10, I could make dinner, do laundry, and watch my little brother while they went out. By 12, I knew exactly which nights Dad would come home drunk enough to slam cabinet doors and which nights he'd just fall asleep in the recliner. Being helpful was never enough, though. I was mouthy, ungrateful, always making a scene. Orion didn't get those words. He got brilliant, my boy, our ticket out of this dump. He was the genius, the STEM camp kid, the one who had science kits for Christmas while I got whatever was on sale. I didn't resent him for it, not then. I loved my brother. I just learned early that love and fairness have never met. The first time my father locked me in the shed, I was 14. He'd been yelling at Orion for knocking over a beer bottle while working on a school project, and I stepped between them. I don't even remember what I said. I just remember the sharp crack of his hand against my cheek, and Marla's intake of breath, half scandalized, half satisfied. "You don't talk to your father like that," she said. Like we were in some kind of etiquette class. Not a war zone. Dad grabbed my arm, marched me through the kitchen past the back door, and shoved me into the little storage room off the side concrete floor, no heat shelves with paint cans and old tools. The door slammed, the deadbolt slid, and suddenly it was just me and the dark. At first I screamed. I pounded on the door until my fists hurt, yelled for my mother, for Orion, for anyone. Nobody came. At some point my voice gave out, and the cold settled into my fingers, my toes, my chest. I remember curling up on an old tarp and trying to count my breaths, promising myself that if I got out, I'd never give them another reason to lock me up again. 4 hours later, Marla opened the door like she was checking on a casserole. "You ready to be calm now?" she asked. My teeth were chattering so hard I couldn't answer. "Good," she said anyway. "Kongai fi hok kachim lang." A girl has to learn to keep quiet. That night rewired something in me. After that, I could tell what kind of mood Dad was in by the way his boots hit the porch. I could tell if Marla was about to explode by the speed she stirred her coffee. I learned to read their faces like forecasts anything to avoid another lesson. But all the reading in the world didn't stop the next storm. One of the neighbors must have heard me during one of those nights in the shed, because a few weeks later, 2 people in nice coats showed up at our door with clipboards and plastic smiles. CPS, Child Protective Services. I watched from the top of the stairs as Marla flew into action, apron on, cookies on a plate, the good candles lit. The house looked like a magazine spread, not the place that had my nail marks in the inside of a closet door. She called up to me and Orion, her voice honey sweet, and when we came down he was in his church shirt, and I had been told exactly what to say. "If you tell them lies, they'll take you away to some foster home," she'd hissed in the hallway, fingers digging into my arm. "Do you want that? You want to end up with strangers?" The social workers asked gentle questions. Did we feel safe? Did anyone ever hit us? Did we ever get locked in rooms? Orion looked at me, eyes wide, unsure. I knew what my truth was. I also knew what happened to people who made Marla look bad. So I smiled until my cheeks hurt and said, "We're fine. Sometimes we get grounded. Nothing serious." They left with their notes, and their business cards promised we could call any time. I never dialed. CPS closed the file for lack of evidence. What I learned that day was simple: when I told the truth, it didn't matter. My parents were good at putting on a show, and I was too scared to pull back the curtain. That knowledge settled into me like sediment. Orion and I grew up in the same house, but not in the same world. While I was bussing tables at a diner by 16, handing over most of my tips to help with utilities, he was going to robotics camp and getting rides to science fairs. Dad bragged about him to anyone who'd listen. About me, he'd say, "She's the one who gives us trouble." By 17, I'd had enough. One fight too many, one threat too many, and I grabbed the duffel I always kept half-packed and walked out. I slept on a friend's couch, then another's. Got a job at a garage because I liked the way engines made sense. Metal didn't gaslight you. Gears either fit or they didn't. I promised myself I was done with that house, done with being the problem child in a family that refused to see itself as the problem. Leaving, though, meant leaving Orion there. Even after he turned 18 and started at a state college nearby, I carried the guilt like a second skin. I checked in. I visited when I could, but every time I drove away from Syracuse back to Albany, I felt like I was abandoning him all over again. Years passed. I built a life that was mine, even if it was messy. One day, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed with a text from Orion. "Got into engineering. Also, I want you to meet someone." Her name was Celine. She was the first person I'd ever seen stand toe-to-toe with my parents and not flinch. An artist with paint on her jeans, and this way of laughing that made you feel like you were in on something. She met me for coffee one afternoon, near the hospital where she worked part-time. "He talks about you. You know," she said, stirring too much sugar into her cup. "Like you're some kind of superhero who escaped a black hole." I told her she didn't know what she was getting into with the veils. She shrugged. "I know what I see. Your mom scares me a little," though, she added, half joking. "She keeps talking about training kids by locking them in rooms for a few hours." I thought she was joking until you flinched. I hadn't realized I'd reacted. Selene's eyes were too sharp. "If anything ever happens to me," she said suddenly, the way people say things they pretend are jokes so they can take them back, "if you react badly, you're the only person I'd trust with my future kid." I waved it off. "Nothing's going to happen to you." 3 years later, I stood in a hospital room holding Lumi for the first time. She was tiny and furious, her face bright red as she wailed, fists balled up like she had something to prove. Selene looked exhausted and blissful. Orion looked like he'd been handed the sun and told not to drop it. Marla and Harlan hovered in the background, cooing about our grandbaby staking their invisible claim. I pressed my nose into that new baby smell and thought, "You have no idea where you just landed, do you?" I made a promise, right there under my breath, that if she ever needed a way out, I would be that way. I didn't say it out loud. Maybe I should have. Driving now through the storm, that old promise thunked back into my chest like a loose tool in the trunk. Selene's email subject line flashed over and over in my mind. "If something happens, promise me you'll protect Lumi." I remembered that coffee shop conversation more clearly than I wanted to, the way she'd said my mother scared her, the way she'd laughed it off, the way I'd let her. I had gotten so good at minimizing my own childhood that I'd minimized her instincts too. "If something happens, you're the only one I trust," she'd said. I'd smiled, changed the subject, told myself I was overreacting to a strict mom. Now standing in the snow by my parents' kitchen door, my hand shaking around the rock, the house looming dark and silent in front of me, I could feel all of it converging every night in the shed, every time CPS had walked away, every time I'd chosen distance over digging in. Back then, I thought, wincing as my knuckles tensed, I swore if I ever had the strength to open that door for a kid, I'd do it, even if it meant going to war with my own family. I took a breath so cold it burned, lifted my arm, and this time I didn't hesitate. I didn't go from breaking that glass straight to being a hero. The night Lumi called was just the moment everything I'd avoided finally came due. It really started a few years earlier on a clear fall morning in Syracuse, when from the outside my family looked almost healthy. Lumi was about 2.5 then. I drove in from Albany for the weekend and climbed the stairs to Orion and Selene's little apartment. It was cramped and a little shabby, but warm. Selene's canvases leaned against the walls, Orion's blueprints were spread over the table, and Lumi waddled around in socks dragging a stuffed fox. Orion had a solid engineering job, Selene was selling art online, and they were making it work. We took Lumi to the park that afternoon. I pushed her on the swings while Orion laughed like he used to when we were kids. Selene watched from a bench, sketchbook in her lap phone, out every time Lumi squealed. My parents hovered too, playing perfect grandparents. Marla insisted on photos. Harlan carried Lumi on his shoulders and bragged about her to anyone who'd listen. For a few hours, I let myself believe maybe the next generation would get something softer than what we'd had. Months later, another storm, another phone call. It was close to 3 a.m. when Orion choked out, "Selene's gone." She'd hit black ice driving home with Lumi, spun out, hit a pole. By the time I got to the hospital, he was sitting on the hallway floor outside a curtained room, hands stained with her blood. Lumi was in pediatrics, asleep under a tangle of wires and cartoon blankets, car seat bruises on her chest, but otherwise lucky, the doctors said. Watching her tiny hand twitch in her sleep, I didn't feel lucky. I felt like the universe had ripped up whatever fragile plan we'd had and laughed. After the funeral, life didn't pause. Orion tried to go back to work. Every design reminded him of conversations he'd had with Celine about their future. He started drinking to sleep then to get through the day. Some nights he answered my calls. Some nights he didn't. When he did, there was a heaviness in his voice that scared me more than any slur. Harlan told him to man up. Marla oscillated between fussing over him and complaining how exhausted she was, always with Lumi on her hip, rehearsing her martyr story for anyone who'd listen. I called as often as I could, begged Orion to see a therapist to join a group, but I was 2 hours away juggling shifts. Phone calls only reached so far. One night he called sounding wrecked but clear. "If I can't pull it together," he said, "will you take her Lumi? If I check myself in somewhere I don't trust them, I trust you." My chest tightened. I pictured my basement apartment in Albany, my ridiculous schedule, the overdraft notices. "Give me a little time," I told him. "I can move things around, bring her to Albany for a while." I meant it even as I said it. The next morning, Marla called first. Her voice was smooth and cold. She said I was confusing Orion, that what he and Lumi needed was stability. Grandparents, not a chaotic single woman with 2 jobs and no plan. Old shame did what it always did. It made me small. By the time we hung up, I had let go of the idea of stepping in, told myself I was being dramatic. Winter came in early. One icy morning, my mother texted, "Orion's gone. Come if you want." At the house, Lumi stood in the hallway with a stuffed rabbit eyes swollen from crying. Harlan held a folded note. In his shaky handwriting, Orion wrote that he was checking into a residential program, that he couldn't be half-present father and broken widower at once. He said he was leaving Lumi with Mom, Dad, and Astra because he trusted us to keep her safe until he came back. He promised he would come back. "We'll apply for guardianship," Harlan said, clapping my shoulder. "State'll help out. Takes the burden off you." I hugged Lumi. "Where's Daddy going?" she whispered. "He's going to get help," I lied. "So he can be the dad you deserve." I stayed a few days. Marla asked me to come with her to the social services office. I listened to her tell the caseworker how 2 aging grandparents just wanted to do right by their granddaughter but were struggling financially. The worker described the monthly stipend. When he named the amount, I saw something sharp and hungry flicker in my mother's eyes. Love and money sat side by side on her face, and for the first time I couldn't tell which one was louder. For a while my visits looked okay on the surface. Lumi was quieter, clingier, but she ran to me at the door, showed me her drawings, fell asleep on my shoulder. Marla talked about church and the park and cookies. I signed the guardianship papers, telling myself I was just formalizing what was temporary until Orion came home. Then work swallowed me. Months blurred. The next time I had a weekend to drive down their house, had a brand new flat-screen TV, new furniture, a designer purse on the chair. Lumi, meanwhile, was thinner. Her eyes had shadows underneath. When I asked what she'd eaten that day, she said bread, water, sometimes soup. The pantry was full. Harlan laughed that I worried too much. Marla said Lumi was picky and made me feel silly for noticing. That night, I saw an unread email from her preschool in the shared inbox. She'd missed most of the month. She was behind, tired, withdrawn. They wanted to meet. The message was 3 weeks old. When I asked, Marla brushed it off. Young teacher, no kids, overreacting, Lumi always sick. Once again, I stood at that same old fork. Push and be the problem, or swallow my fear and hope I was wrong. I swallowed it. Now parked in front of their dark house with snow pounding the windshield and Lumi's broken little voice in my ear, every one of those moments lined up and pointed in the same direction. The new things. The shrinking child. The ignored school warnings. The stipend my parents suddenly seemed to build their life around. I had chosen denial because the alternative meant admitting my parents might hurt a grandchild as easily as they'd hurt me. The stone in my hand felt like a verdict. When I raised it toward the glass, I knew I wasn't just breaking into a house. I was finally admitting who I was really up against. The rock smashed the kitchen door window with a sharp crack, and freezing air rushed out like the house was sighing. I reached through the jagged hole, flipped the lock, and pushed my way inside. The cold hit me first. It was the kind of deep chill that meant the heat had been off for hours, maybe longer. I hit the light switch out of habit. Nothing. Somewhere in the dark, the refrigerator hummed weakly. I slid my phone from my pocket, turned on the flashlight, and stepped into the room I grew up in. The narrow beam swept over dirty dishes cemented with dried sauce pizza boxes stacked on the counter and overflowing trash can. Old food smells clung to everything. What I didn't see was any sign that someone had made a real meal lately for a 5-year-old who should have been asleep in a warm bed, not whispering to me that she was starving. Lumi. My voice sounded wrong in the stillness. I checked the living room blank TV remote wedged under a cushion, toys half buried in dust bunnies. The hallway was lined with family photos, my parents smiling, Orion in his cap and gown, Lumi in costumes for holidays I'd half missed because I was working. All of them stared back silent while the house felt deserted. Back in the kitchen, something small by the back door caught my light. Lumi's sneakers lay on their sides, toes pointed at the wall. Next to them, a pink plastic cup sat on the floor, tipped just enough that the water inside had crusted with ice at the rim. Whatever she'd last drunk had been a long time ago. That and the silence made my skin crawl. Between the kitchen and the laundry room was the door I'd feared and hated my whole childhood. The storage room, the shed. Someone had added a shiny new padlock and metal hasp. I dropped to my knees, pressed my ear to the wood, and smelled damp cloth, old cardboard, and the sharp sting of urine seeping out at the bottom. A little towel was jammed under the door ends, shredded like small fingers had worried them apart. Lumi, I whispered, pressing my palm flat against the panel. Baby, are you in there? For a moment there was only the wind outside. Then I heard a tiny shaky breath like someone trying very hard not to cry. My heart slammed into my throat. I tried jamming my pocket knife into the lock, knowing it was useless. Hang on, I said, mostly to keep myself from falling apart. I'm going to get you out. I ran back into the storm, dug the small pry bar out of my trunk with numb hands, and was back at the door when my phone lit up with a call from my father. His name glowed on the screen for one long second. Answering meant explanations and blame. Lumi didn't have time for that. I hit decline, shoved the phone into my coat, wedged the metal bar under the hasp, braced my foot, and pulled. The first yank made my shoulders burn. The second ripped the screws out of the frame with a shriek. The padlock snapped sideways and the door swung inward. The smell rolled over me, cold, sour, human. My light found Lumi in the far corner, curled on a pile of blankets that looked more like trash. A thin throw was draped over her knees. Her arms were wrapped tight around her ribs. Her lips were pale, her face puffy from crying, her little body shuddering with constant shivers. Hey, I said, crossing the room in 2 steps. It's me. It's Aunt Astra. Her eyes opened slowly. When she saw me, her whole face crumpled and she reached out. I dropped the pry bar and scooped her up. She felt as light and stiff as something left outside in winter. Her fingers dug into my coat like talons. I'm so cold, she whispered. I was so scared. Grandpa said I had to be quiet. I tried to be good. You were good? I said, throat tightening. None of this is your fault. You hear me? Not one bit of this is your fault. With one arm around her, I called 911 with the other hand. The call dropped twice before I found a spot near the front window where the signal caught. I gave the dispatcher our address, said the words I'd been avoiding for years. Child locked in an unheated room. Signs of neglect, needs an ambulance now. They told me to keep her warm and wait. I wrapped my coat around her, carried her to the car, settled her in the back, turned the heater all the way up and layered an old blanket over her. She curled toward the vents, still shaking, still gripping my sleeve like a lifeline. I'd just shut her door when new headlights climbed the street and swung into the driveway. A white sedan. My parents. Harlan got out first, shoulders hunched, jaw set. Marla followed, arms wrapped tight around herself, eyes already scanning everything. "What the hell are you doing here, Astra?" he demanded. "Not where's Lumi, not is everyone okay, just annoyance." "I got a call from your granddaughter," I said, stepping between them and the car. "She told me she was alone, starving, freezing. I found her locked in the shed." Marla's eyes flicked to the broken glass, then to the small shape under blankets in my backseat. Her face went pale, then hard. "You broke into our house," she hissed. "Have you lost your mind?" "She's been in there for hours," I snapped. "No food, no heat. It's below zero. She could have died." "She crawled in there herself," Harlan said with a snort. "Kid likes to hide. She's dramatic." "You wouldn't understand how to raise kids." "You never listened either." Something inside me that had bent around them my whole life finally refused to bend. "I remember exactly how you raised me," I said. "I remember begging to be let out of that same room while you turned up the TV. You called me bad, and no one believed me. I believe her." He took a step toward me, trying to fill the space. Marla grabbed his sleeve, but only to glance toward the neighbors' windows, checking if anyone was watching. "She's our granddaughter," she said sharply. "You can't just take her. People will think I don't care what people think. I cut in. "The ambulance is on its way. They're going to see what you've done. You don't get to lock a 5-year-old in a freezing closet and still pretend you're the good guys. If you drive off with her, that's kidnapping," Harlan said. "Call it whatever lets you sleep," I replied. My hand was already on the driver's door. Underneath the shaking, a strange calm settled in. "I'm taking her to the hospital. You are not stopping me." He hesitated. That sliver of doubt was all I needed. I slid into the seat, hit the locks, and met his eyes through the glass as he grabbed for the handle. For once, he couldn't get in. "I will keep her safe," I said, voice steady. For once, I'm choosing the child over the story. Then I put the car in gear and drove away, watching my parents shrink in the rearview mirror until they were just two dark shapes disappearing into a storm. I was finally done standing in with them. By the time I carried Lumi through the sliding doors of St. Joseph's, her skin felt like ice through the layers of blankets. A nurse took one look at her and called out for a warming room. They moved fast, hands lifting her gently off my shoulder, a thermometer pressed under her arm, heated blankets wrapped around her, while warm mist rose from a humidifier. I stood just outside the room, my hands still shaking from cold and adrenaline, watching through the glass as a doctor adjusted the monitors clipped to her tiny fingers. A nurse asked me who I was, who Lumi lived with, why she had been exposed to cold long enough for her temperature to dip to dangerous levels. Every question dug into me like a blade. "She lives with her grandparents," I said. "I found her locked in a storage room in their house." Saying it out loud made my voice break. Dr. Patel met me in the hallway. His face was calm, but his tone wasn't. He said Lumi had severe malnutrition and dehydration. Her body temperature had dropped enough to be life-threatening. "This didn't happen overnight," he told me. "It takes weeks for a child to get this depleted." Weeks. My knees almost buckled. I had thought it was bad. I hadn't thought it was this. Hospital protocol meant CPS was called immediately. A social worker named Rowan arrived, a calm man with a notebook and steady eyes. He asked me to start at the beginning. I told him about Lumi's call, the drive through the blizzard, the locked door breaking into the house. I left nothing out. When I finished, he said something that froze me more than the wind outside could have. "You should know," he said quietly, "CPS had an open file on your family years ago." My stomach turned. "When I was a kid," he nodded. "It was closed for lack of evidence. Families who are very good at controlling the narrative usually slip through." I exhaled shakily. Of course they had. When Lumi stabilized enough to talk, Rowan and Dr. Patel spoke to her in a slow, gentle cadence. I stayed beside her so she wouldn't shut down. Between tremors and soft hiccups, Lumi said she was locked up when she cried too much. She said she got bread and water most days. She said Grandma told her she needed to eat less so she wouldn't grow wrong, and Grandpa told her she needed to learn to be quiet. Each word felt like someone pressing their thumb into an old bruise I'd spent years pretending didn't hurt. Rowan stepped out to get updates on the financial investigation CPS could legally request. When he came back, his face had hardened. The state sent 18 months of stipend records. Every payment was withdrawn in cash immediately. No receipts for groceries, school supplies, medical visits. He showed me a printed summary. Jewelry, clothing, electronics. Not a single item related to caring for a child. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the wave of guilt that crashed through me. I called Lumi's teacher at Woodland Elementary to check on school attendance. She told me Lumi had missed nearly an entire semester. Every warning email and phone call went unanswered. She told me Lumi had a chronic illness, the teacher said. But there was never any documentation. There was none at the hospital either. My phone buzzed over and over, my parents calling. I let every ring pass. When Rowan called them himself, Harlan answered with his usual fake concern, demanding to know where his granddaughter was. He accused me of being unstable, said I'd always had emotional problems, said he feared for Lumi's safety around me. The pattern was so predictable, it made my skin crawl. Attack the person telling the truth, so no one looks too closely at the lie. Later, a nurse asked gently if there was a history of abuse in my family. I didn't answer right away. For the first time, I let myself hear the truth instead of the story I'd used to survive. Yes, I finally said. There was. Rowan returned with a folder and sat beside me. You need to know something, he said. You left that house. You broke the cycle. That matters. You have a stable address, steady income, and a documented history of protecting Lumi. If you want custody, this is the moment. My hands tightened on the blanket over my lap. I had spent so much of my life afraid of confronting my parents that the thought of fighting them felt like stepping into a fire barefoot. But looking through the window at Lumi, tiny under heated blankets with sensors taped to her skin, the fear dissolved. I'll file for temporary custody, I said. Rowan slid the form toward me. Sign here. As my pen moved across the page, something clicked into place, something steady, almost fierce. For once in my life, the thing guiding me wasn't fear. It was the promise I'd made years ago in a hospital room, holding a newborn who had no idea the world she'd been born into. I signed my name, and didn't look back. Preparing for the hearing meant driving back to Albany to meet a lawyer recommended by a coworker. Aster Bloom had sharp eyes, a quiet voice, and the kind of focus that made you sit straighter. She spread everything out on her desk: hospital reports, CPS notes, school emails, photos of the shed, and said, "This is a serious case, but your parents will fight. People like them always do." That night, I listened to a voicemail from my father. "You don't know what you're getting into, Astra." His voice wasn't angry. It was something worse, afraid. Of what? What danger could me caring for Lumi bring him? Aster told me not to engage, but the message stuck to me. My father didn't fear losing custody. He feared something being uncovered. When CPS asked me to return to Syracuse to gather more information, I went. A neighbor, Mrs. Dunley, opened her door before I even knocked twice. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," she said. She told us she'd heard Lumi crying for help. She'd confronted Marla once, only to be told Lumi was dramatic. She'd seen a bruise on Lumi's arm. Then she added something that made my skin prickle. There was a man who kept showing up. Before your brother disappeared. He and Orion argued outside one night. Loud. Orion looked terrified. Terrified. Not grieving, not overwhelmed, scared. And suddenly Orion's sudden departure didn't look like collapse. It looked like pressure. Or danger. Back at my apartment, I opened the old email from Celine that had resurfaced in my inbox that night. I read it slowly, line by line. She wrote about how Marla insisted on taking over every aspect of caring for Lumi, how she undermined Celine's decisions, suggested feeding schedules, punished crying. Celine said she felt pushed out, erased. And at the end, if anything happens to me or Orion, please remember, they're not who you think they are. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Maybe Celine hadn't just sensed control. Maybe she sensed something darker, something that didn't end with her. The temporary custody hearing happened 2 days later. I sat with Astor while my parents walked in with their own lawyer, dressed like they were attending a church picnic, performative, impeccable. Harlan stared straight ahead. Marla dabbed her eyes with a tissue before anything even began. Their lawyer started by calling me unstable. Said I'd run away at 17, had a marriage fall apart, worked low-wage jobs, lived in a small apartment unsuitable for a child. He said my parents were pillars of their community, had raised 2 children, and were the only stable home Lumi knew. When it was Astor's turn, she spoke plainly, almost gently, as if the truth didn't need height, it had weight. She submitted the hospital report, photos of Lumi's condition, documentation from CPS, school attendance records. She played a short, shaky video from my phone the moment I'd opened the shed door and Lumi reached for me. The courtroom went silent except for the faint audio of Lumi whispering she was cold. Harlan burst out crying. Loud theatrical sobs about how much he loved his granddaughter. Marla stood abruptly and shouted that Lumi was difficult, sensitive, too attached to strangers. She caught herself mid-sentence and sank back down when her lawyer pulled at her sleeve. Then Rowan entered with the official CPS report. He stated clearly that Lumi had been neglected, showed signs of emotional abuse, and lived in an environment where state funds meant for her care were misused. When Rowan read the financial summary listing each stipend withdrawal, each unrelated purchase, Marla's face drained of color. The judge took a long breath before speaking. She ordered that Lumi remain under my care until the full custody hearing. My parents were granted supervised visitation only. Their lawyer objected. The judge overruled him. As soon as the gavel struck, Harlan pointed at me with a trembling hand and said, "You don't understand what you've started." Maybe I didn't. Maybe the history of our family was deeper than what I'd lived through. Maybe Orion's last days at home were not just grief, but fear. Maybe the truth about Celine's accident wasn't as clean as it had seemed. But as I walked out of that courthouse, Lumi's tiny hand wrapped around my finger, all I could think was, if protecting her meant digging through every buried secret the Vale family had ever hidden, then I would. Because this time, the story wasn't theirs to control anymore. After the temporary hearing, I drove back to Albany with Lumi asleep in the back seat and a box of old papers riding shotgun. I'd grabbed it from my storage unit when I stopped for gas folders and envelopes I'd shoved away the week Orion disappeared. At home, after tucking Lumi into my bed and leaving the door cracked so she could see the hall light, I sat on the living room floor with that box between my knees. Receipts, old bills, a half-finished drawing of a robot Lumi had helped Orion design. At the bottom was a thin envelope with my name on it. The handwriting made my chest tighten. "If you're reading this," it said on the front, "it means I didn't make it back the way I planned." It took me a full minute to slit it open. Orion wrote about how after Celine died, the house felt haunted by everything she'd touched. How he'd started to drink to silence the noise in his head. But then his words shifted. He said Dad kept insisting Lumi belonged to the Vale bloodline, not to Celine. Mom criticized every choice he made, said Celine had no idea how to be a mother, and they were just trying to repair the damage. He wrote about a man who came by late at night, always talking to Harlan in the driveway. Orion said he overheard enough to know this guy was pushing some kind of plan about guardianship. He told me Orion wrote that if I didn't sign over custody, he'd make sure stuff Celine left behind got dragged into court. He wouldn't say what, just kept hinting. I don't know if he was bluffing, but I was scared he'd smear her. Toward the end, Orion mentioned seeing a tiny red light blinking in the storage room one night, then disappearing when he opened the door. He thought they'd installed a camera. Dad kept the only key and locked it whenever Lumi cried too long or I argued with him. If they're filming us, he wrote, it's not for our safety. It's for proof in some version of this story they want to sell. I remembered suddenly and with perfect clarity being a teenager in that same room, catching a faint red glow near the ceiling and thinking it was my imagination. Maybe it hadn't been. A few days later, armed with a court order, Rowan, 2 officers, and I went back to the Syracuse house. Marla and Harlan were told to stay in the living room while the search happened. I could feel their eyes on my back as I led the group down the hallway and opened the door to the storage room. At first, all the officers saw was what I remembered: shelves, boxes, the stained blankets Lumi had been sleeping on. Then, one of them leaned against the back wall and frowned at the hollow sound beneath his hand. They pulled away a warped board and found a narrow cavity. Inside, a cheap little camera, a receiver, a memory unit the size of a thumb. It wasn't high-tech. It didn't have to be. They plugged the device into a laptop at the dining table. Marla hovered, insisting it was for security, that anyone would do the same. But when the first video loaded, even she fell quiet. Clip after clip showed Lumi in that room crying until her voice gave out, curling into herself, rubbing her arms for warmth. In one, she begged to be let out because she had to use the bathroom. No one came. Then another folder. Older. The angle was slightly different, the resolution grainier, but I knew that girl. 14, maybe 13, pounding on the door, shouting hoarsely, promising to be good. At one point, she slid down the frame and just sat there, forehead on her knees. I watched myself stop screaming and go silent. Marla's legs gave out. She sank into a chair, sobbing. I was trying to teach you, she gasped. I was trying to teach both of you how to behave. I only did what I knew. My heart clenched, but not out of sympathy. She wasn't mourning what she'd done. She was mourning being forced to see it. Harlan stared at the screen, jaw locked, offering nothing. While they were still reeling, one of the officers opened my father's desk and found a bank slip. A transfer from a man named Damon Krill. The name shot straight back to me from Orion's letter. Rowan's eyes widened. He recognized it too. Damon had been investigated in a case where he'd coached families on how to milk state assistance. With pressure from CPS and the DA's office, Damon agreed to meet with Astor and Rowan in a small conference room at the courthouse. He showed up, sweaty and nervous, eyes darting everywhere. As soon as we mentioned the camera and the hospital records, he folded. He admitted Harlan had come to him wanting advice on how to document that Lumi was better off with her grandparents than with her father. How to make her seem fragile, special needs, so the state would funnel more support money their way. He said the girl wasn't really Celine's. Damon muttered, avoiding my eyes. Said she was pure veil, that Celine was just carrying on what wasn't hers. He talked like that gave him rights. The room tilted for a second. If Dad had really claimed that, then either he believed a lie, or he was trying to rewrite reality for everyone around him. Neither possibility made me feel any less sick. Damon also confessed that Harlan had paid him to dig into Celine's records before she died. Employment, medical history, anything that could be used to question her in court if it came to that. He wanted leverage, Damon said. So if your brother fought, he could push him. Leveraging grief. Leveraging a dead woman's history. Leveraging a child. That night, back at the hospital, I watched Lumi sleep, cheeks fuller already from a week of real food and warmth, monitors humming softly. I thought about Orion's letter, Celine's email, Dad's threats. Had Orion run to get clean or to get away from whatever our father was building? Had Selene sensed this long before any of us? Was Harlan ever capable of seeing Lumi as an actual child, or had she just become another piece on the board he thought he controlled? Standing there in the dim light, I had the strangest feeling, like standing on the edge of a frozen lake and hearing the first crack form under your feet. I knew I was close to the whole truth. I just wasn't sure yet how far it would go when it finally broke. The courtroom for the final hearing was fuller this time. CPS hospital staff, our lawyers, a representative from the DA's office, and a couple of people from Orion's old CPS file all took their seats. Lumi stayed home with a sitter. I didn't want her anywhere near this. My parents' lawyer went first. He painted a picture of two overwhelmed grandparents doing their best. He said Marla's age and frail nerves had led her to make poor choices in discipline. He said Harlan's old-school approach had been misinterpreted. He called the shed incidents isolated misunderstandings. Then the judge asked to see the footage from the storage room. The video of Lumi in that thin blanket filled the screen. Her voice, small and hoarse, echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Nobody spoke. When the clip shifted to my 14-year-old self, the silence deepened. It was no longer just about one child. It was about a pattern laid bare. Marla sobbed loudly, clutching a tissue to her face. Harlan stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping. Aster stood and introduced the letter from Orion and the email from Celine. She read the part where Celine said, "If anything happens to me or Orion, remember, they're not who you think they are." Then she explained something I hadn't known until the night before. Celine had undergone genetic testing while pregnant due to a family concern. The hospital had her DNA and Lumi's newborn blood work on file. With the court's permission, the lab had run a comparison. The results were clear. Lumi was biologically the child of both Celine and Orion, with no doubt. Every story Harlan had told about Vale blood bypassing Celine collapsed under that single page of science. Any claim that Ms. Celine was not this child's mother, the judge said, tapping the document, was either delusion or manipulation. A CPS worker who'd handled Orion's earlier file testified next. He explained that Orion had reached out preparing to file a complaint about his parents pressuring him to hand over custody. Before that complaint could be formalized, Orion vanished. There was no proof of foul play, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The judge leaned back. So we have grandparents who installed surveillance in a punishment room, misused state funds, misrepresented a child's health and attendance, and exerted pressure on a grieving father while attempting to erase the child's mother from her own story. That is not care. That is control. When it became obvious where this was going, something in Harlan snapped. He lurched to his feet, pointing at me. "She's ours!" he shouted. "Everything is ours. Astra has been trouble since she could talk, and now she's stealing my granddaughter. That girl should have been locked up longer when she was little. Might have beaten that attitude out of her." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment I was 13 again, feeling the slam of the shed door. Then I felt Lumi's small hand in mine, not here but in memory, and the echo lost some of its power. The judge's face hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Vale," she said. "You just confirmed more than any report could." When she finally read the ruling, my body didn't move at first. Full legal custody to me. No visitation rights for Harlan and Marla. A formal referral to the DA's office for charges related to neglect and abuse. An order for CPS to keep the file open. It wasn't until Aster squeezed my arm that I realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out slowly. It felt like air after years of breathing underwater. As we were leaving, a detective intercepted me in the corridor. "Ms. Vale, we got a call you should know about, from a man identifying himself as Orion Vale." The hallway tilted. "He's alive. He's in a treatment center in Vermont," the detective said. "He heard about the case. He asked if we could pass along that he'd like to see you. When you're ready." A month later, Lumi and I walked into a quiet facility surrounded by pines and snow. Orion was thinner streaks of gray in his hair, but his eyes were clearer than I'd seen since before Selene died. Lumi froze for a second in the doorway, then ran. He dropped to his knees as if his legs gave out arms wide, and when she crashed into him, he sobbed into her hair like he was the child this time. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry I left you there." I stood back watching them cling to each other, feeling years of anger and fear uncoil into something complicated and softer. Orion and I talked for hours that weekend. He chose to stay and continue long-term treatment. We agreed that for now, Lumi would live with me, and he would rebuild himself into the father she needed him to be. Back in Albany, life didn't magically turn perfect. Lumi had nightmares. Sometimes a slammed door or a raised voice would send her under the table. But slowly she began to laugh more than she flinched. She learned that in our home doors were for privacy, not punishment. One afternoon, as we were unpacking her drawings onto the fridge, she said, "Aunt Astra, I'm not scared of the dark anymore, because here nobody locks me in it." I pulled her into a hug so tight she squeaked. "Nobody ever will," I said. "Not while I'm here." Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep with a flashlight still gripped in her hand, just in case I stepped out onto the tiny balcony of our apartment. The wind in Albany was sharp, but it didn't cut the way Syracuse's used to. I thought about that small, unheated room, about the girl I'd been, and the girl Lumi almost didn't get to grow into. I looked at our front door, sturdy and plain. For a long time, that symbol had meant one thing to me, a barrier between me and the people who were supposed to love me. Now it meant something else. I had finally opened the door I couldn't open as a child. And this time, I wasn't walking out alone. I was carrying Lumi with me, both of us stepping into a life where family might finally mean what it was always supposed to.